It's explaining the link between territorial control and violence in Sierra Leone.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop, and we're here to talk about Emma Boyle's paper, Explaining the Link Between Group Strength and Violence in the Sierra Leone Civil War. And Jess, if you would get us started, please.
Yep. Okay, so overall, I thought that this was, it made some really valuable contributions, particularly with data and with adding, with separating the types of violence. I thought one of the best sentences that I read was that instead of viewing civil wars, in your introduction, instead of viewing civil wars in which violence, or instead of viewing civil wars as violence as such, you view civil wars in which violence of varying types takes place. And I think that's a good contribution. My comments are kind of going to go like how you set it up, and then some of your definitions, and then your theory, and then your data. So basically in your setup, just a couple of smaller things. I expect you to address, well, you say that you're going to address whether rebels and governments are driven by the same or different logics, and that's kind of one of your motivating factors of your paper. And then you find that they use it differently, but then I think in the conclusion you say that they actually use it the same because they're using it, so they're both using violence against civilians in, I forget if it's rebel-controlled territory, I think rebel-controlled territory, or government-controlled territory, and military engagements in rebel-controlled. So you say they're actually using it the same in the conclusion, but it would be different logics. And so I just think that you need to make sure that that's consistent throughout and think about that. In your setup, and I'm going to come back to this, but I think you set up a little bit of a straw man emphasizing that the common categories of Civil War violence are discriminate versus indiscriminate. Discriminate versus indiscriminate simply disaggregates your civilian violence category further, but it doesn't involve military engagements, and really what you're adding is you're taking the civilian violence, and instead of looking at it as discriminate or indiscriminate, you're taking it and looking at it as maybe non-sexual violence and sexual violence, and then adding in military engagements. But I don't know that indiscriminate and discriminate, you keep coming back to that, but I'm not sure that that really helps you. Then the final thing in the setup is that you, what did I just do? Okay. Is that you posit an inverse relationship between military engagements and violence against civilians. But I didn't end up seeing that in, I saw it in your results a little bit, but I think really emphasizing that in your results, and this is again something that I'll come back to, but graphs would really, really help to show, to make your introduction kind of connect with everything else. When you get to start defining things, you talk about violence as physical violence, and I think in the definitions, I think you say later that you're talking about violence, both bodily violence and violence against property, and it would help to say that up front, because I was thinking physical violence, oh, that's just bodily violence, and then you talk about burning villages, and I got confused, and then it's finally clarified in the data section, but that'd be something helpful to put up front. A couple of more conceptual issues. One is that you say sexual violence is conceptually different than violence against civilians. But, of course, sexual violence is a form of physical violence. And you talk a little bit about it being perpetrated against combatants, but I would presume that most of the time it would be perpetrated against civilians. And I think that's something that perhaps you could clarify a little bit more in your theory, and then in your data as well. Are you talking about sexual violence against members of the military, against rebels? Or are you talking about sexual violence against civilians? Are you talking about both? Does your data get at both? But you say it's, I think you're making the argument that it's conceptually different than violence against civilians because it's more of a social taboo. I don't want to say worse, but it's more of a social taboo. But then you also say that most governments don't think that it constitutes a crime against humanity if it takes place during war. You say that rape against a married woman isn't actually considered rape. And I would presume that the killing of civilians is a social taboo as well. So I think you just need to think a little bit more and just justify it a little more. I think most people would intuitively say, okay, yes, sexual violence is different than going in and burning a village, but just explaining a little more why that those are conceptually distinct. Another kind of definitional issue that I saw, or not issue, but just question maybe, is your discussion of strategy versus tactics. And you continue to talk about it doesn't matter kind of how, I'll go over this. Yeah.
Can I interrupt and say hi, Paige?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. If you would mute your microphone, we're getting feedback. So if you could go up to the top and just click on it. Yes. Success. And then, Paige, when you're ready to jump in, you'll have to unmute your mic. So you'll see we're all doing that. Otherwise, we get the feedback. Sorry about that, Jess. Thanks.
So we talk about the different forms of violence as strategy and not tactics. And I think, so I actually called my little brother this morning, who's a Marine, to ask him about strategy and tactics, and he agreed with like what you said. But one of the questions that I had was, you're not connecting them to goals in the war. And so, yes, I see how it doesn't matter necessarily, you know, like if they're using violence against civilians as a strategy, and then you can say a tactic is, do they use it discriminately, do they use it indiscriminately, do they use it by bombing, which may be indiscriminate, or, you know, targeting. But if it's not attached to goals, then I find it difficult to just ignore what sort of, like, the actual tactics or what sort of violence they're using. And I feel like at times, yes, these different types of violence can be used as a strategy, but then it also could be used as a tactic. So the central command could say, okay, we want to make the government appear weak, and now each unit, that's our overall strategy, is to make the government appear weak, and we, depending on what village you encounter, will depend on the tactics that you use there. Whether that be in this village, sexual violence is going to work better. In this village, you know, actually military engagement is going to work better. And so I think you just have to be careful there, and I think attaching what they're doing to some sort of overarching goal, and how, and you kind of get this in your theory, but how the use of different forms of violence contribute to those goals, but also different, what you would call tactics within those violence. So how would sexual mutilation maybe contribute differently than rape or something like that. And okay, so then in your, oh, and then just a simple thing, I would move your discussion of the definitions of your categories of violence up in that section, because you first basically justify what we're talking about, and then you tell us what we're talking about. And so I think that would be better to just flip it. As far as your theory, you begin with a discussion of irrationality versus rationality. And sorry. And so I had a couple of issues with that. One, how are you defining rationality? Because you're going back and forth, but I'm not sure if changes between rationality and irrationality are because there's a change in the potential cost, there's a change in the benefits, there's a change in the likelihood of winning the war. And then with your assertion of irrationality so I don't think that killing civilians is necessarily an irrational strategy, irrational tactic. And it seems that you make several assumptions when you talk about this, and one is that the combatants are at parity, because in the next paragraph then you talk about how there's significant power disparities. And so at those points it seems like engaging combatants, did I just turn this off? Sorry.
I think you turned your camera off. There we go. Yep. All right, you're back.
Something popped up and gave me that option. So engaging combatants actually sometimes would seem more irrational, particularly if you're at parity, than targeting civilians, because you would have an equal chance of losing as of winning, than as opposed to like targeting civilians and nobody's shooting back at you. So that was one issue. And then you assume that killing civilians will deplete civilian support for the perpetrators, but I don't think that's always necessarily the case. Is killing non-supporters could encourage others to support you with more resources or by joining forces, especially if you're killing the right people. If you're killing the people who aren't supporting you, that shows, you know, okay, the next people deterring other people from not supporting. And then you're also assuming that when they're, it seems like you're assuming that when they're targeting civilians, they're also engaging the other military, because you talk about opening more fronts and splitting resources. But your theory seemed to be about making a choice between the two. And so I guess I was having a little bit of trouble with the rationality, irrationality thing and kind of the implicit assumptions in there. And then finally, you talk about, there's a site in here that terrorist groups never get policy concessions. But Wood and Kathman just found in 2014 article, found that when rebels kill civilians, they're more likely to get a peace agreement. That's not necessarily saying that they're getting the concessions that they want, but they're getting something, right? And so I think the evidence is kind of can cut either way on that. Sorry, my computer died, so I'm using my husband's computer, and it's not scrolling like I want it to. I think, and then there's some other issues within that maybe we'll probably get to as we go, but in this section, I guess one of the big issues, though, is when you're discussing the strength of the sides, are you talking about relative strength or absolute strength? Sometimes it seems you're talking about relative, but then you're with the government, you're just, it's your hypotheses seem to be absolute strength, and so that was something that was very unclear to me. And then one other issue with the theory was, or just a question really, does it matter how the war is going? So you talk about strength, but I wonder if a specific form of violence hasn't worked, will they try a new one? So if, you know, maybe they're moderately strong or moderately weak, depending on how you look at it, and they're killing civilians, but that hasn't worked. And so will they then go down to sexual violence, or will they ratchet it up and engage militarily? But does that change how they look at things? Data-wise, so I think it's key, and you do this a little bit, but make sure you highlight the novelty of the data, because I think that that's a big contribution here, is that you're looking at this really fine-grained data, which is good. One question I had, and I'm assuming that this is the case, but you don't say it specifically, is that you're ensuring that the TRC data and the UCDP data aren't duplicating each other. Assuming you're doing that, but I would just put it explicitly in there. And then when you're actually operationalizing your variables and running your models, so there's two big questions or issues that I had. One was that you don't look at places or instances where there is no violence. And so you begin your introduction saying, with the question, where in the country does the violence take place? But you're not actually able to answer that. And then you also have, you were able to answer perhaps where different types of violence take place, but not the actual violence. And then you have your graph down on page 24 that looks at the spikes of violence. But again, you're not really able to explain why there are spikes in time, because you're not looking at instances where there's no violence, which is fine if that's not what you want to do, but you know, you bring those issues up, and so it'd be nice to try and figure out a way to get at that, and I think that means potentially running models with a different unit of analysis. So it basically, it looks like instead of saying, you know, what's the type of violence, where and when does it occur, but it's more given that the combatant was going to use violence in a particular place at a particular time, what type of violence did they choose is the question that you're answering. And if that's what you want to be answering, like, that's fine, but you just need to make sure that you're kind of clear about that. I had a question about why there's more, so what military engagements actually, how they're coded, because there's more government military engagements than rebel military engagements. And so, and I would assume that there should be the same number. So I was wondering if it's just participating or if it's actually who initiated it. And if it's just participants, then I think you have a problem because it's only a choice by one side, the initiator, and then the other side just has to fight back and defend. If it's the initiator, then you don't have that same problem. And then the other big issue that I saw was the idea of control of territory as strength to indicate what types of violence you're going to see. Your hypothesis says a strong rebel force will use military engagements where it's strong. So that means where it controls territory, with how you're measuring it, it's going to use military engagements. But it should have no reason to initiate a military engagement there because it already controls the territory, right? So a strong rebel force should have no motivation to engage in their own district where they control. They should have a motivation, if they're strong, to go into government territory and engage in military engagement there, and try to gain more territory, right? So I was trying to think of other proxies that might work with the territorial data that you've collected, and one might be the percent of territory the rebel group holds, or the percent in a particular area. So for instance, battles in the eastern region could be judged by the percent of territory held by each side in the east. So presumably if the rebels are strong in the east, they may be more likely to engage in military engagements in the east, but in villages controlled by the government to kind of secure their stronghold there. Or you might want to consider, using other measures of strength as robustness tests. I know most of them don't vary very well, but I don't know. And then just a couple of your control variables. It would be nice to just have a discussion about what they mean in there somewhere. For instance, democracy and GDP, I would imagine that they don't change very much over time. I wouldn't think, maybe I'm wrong, but they're country level, so they're obviously not changing, throughout the districts or whatever. But yet you find that they're significant in some of your models, and so what does that mean? And then a question about what types of violence occur together. So you talk about how you separate some violence into different events if they occur together, if the military engagement and they kill civilians. How often do they occur together? And how often do they occur kind of back to back, where we might see civilian violence preceding or following military engagements? And we could see it maybe not as strength, but maybe as either preparing the ground for a military engagement or retribution for, if you have a military engagement and then you immediately have civilian violence, maybe that's retribution once you gain that control of that territory. Now you're able to punish the people who didn't support you or something like that. And then finally, I have more comments that I'll send to you, or like we'll talk about as we go. But I would like to hear more about your full models. You don't actually put your full models at the end. You just do, with each single variable, single independent variable. So full models would be nice, and then graphs would be huge. A type of violence based on control levels or based on who's using it, but that would be really, really helpful. So that's where I'm going to stop right now.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Paige, let me just catch you up. Whenever you want to put a new issue on the agenda, just give me a one finger. If you want to jump on a current issue, too. Let's turn it to Emma, and I'll ask you that. I know that's a lot to digest. Why don't you pick a couple of things that you want to respond to, and for the rest of you, the queue is open. So anytime you want to, give me a one finger or two finger, just feel free. Emma?
Okay, thank you. Those were great comments and really helpful. So I will try and pick out a few, although that's going to be a bit difficult in and of itself. So to start with the your first point, the discrepancy between the logic of the rebels and the military, I think you're right. I think I do need to be more consistent because I think what I'm arguing in the paper, what I'm trying to argue is that there are slightly different paths of logic, but we should see the same outcome. And I think you're right that I haven't been clear enough about that. And similarly with the discriminant and indiscriminate violence being a bit of a straw man, and that echoes some of Catherine's comments that she sent in this morning. So I need to make sure that I'm not falling into those kinds of traps. So talking about conceptual differences between violence against civilians and sexual violence. Obviously, sexual violence is or can very easily be seen as a subset of violence against civilians. I think what I was trying to get at here, and again, I don't think I've been clear enough about, is that a lot of the findings from the sexual violence literature indicates that that we don't see violence against civilians and sexual violence in tandem as much as I think we might expect to. So they do seem to be used as different strategies. The sexual violence is not just a spillover of a kind of more generalized incident of violence against civilians. So I think that's what I was trying to get at, but again, that's something that I think I should probably clarify. You had a few questions on the theory that I'll just address. I'll try and address quite quickly. So you commented about the opening up of the two fronts, but the theory seems to be about choice. And I think what I'm trying to do, and it's kind of difficult given kind of how we have to, in a lot of ways, set the data up, because it ends up being presented as this either-or choice. But often we find that different strategies are being used simultaneously. So I have another paper on this that looks cross-nationally, and we find, I find in the same year, the groups are often using at least two forms of violence. And so when I'm trying to get down to the more micro level, it is really, I would argue that it is really about that they do open up two fronts, because it's unusual for it to be the case where they're just engaged against the military or they're just engaged against civilians. They're often doing this simultaneously, so they are kind of splitting their strength between different opponents. And what I'm trying to get at with the micro level data that I have here is why are they using different strategies in kind of different places, and can that be explained by the strength within that particular area? And again, similarly with your question about relative strength or absolute strength, that's something that I need to clarify. But within the micro level studies, it is relative strength. So it is, is the RUF stronger in this area than the military? and that's really what I'm looking at. And then just to clarify a couple of your questions on the data, I did go through the two data sets as I combined them and make sure that there was no duplicates. There were a couple, there was actually fewer duplicates than you might expect, which I think tells us something about the data. But there were a few that I had to take out to make sure there weren't duplications. I have another data set where I'm looking at village month, and that looks at whether there is violence or not per village month. But that's in a very kind of early stage, so I can't really talk much to that at the moment, but it's something that I've kind of been thinking about. Different rebel. Oh, your question about why there are different numbers of battles in the two data sets, that's actually not due to initiator. That is purely due to the fact that with some of the territorial control variables and some of the control variables, more of them have dropped out of the analysis when it comes to the rebel groups as compared to the government. And yeah, I need to think more about if there are other measures of strength. I mean, what I would really love to be able to do is measure the kind of military strength of the unit in the area, but I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. But other measures, as robustness checks or alternative measures, I would be very keen to explore. So I guess.
Great, thank you.
Questions?
We have a pretty wide open queue. Got Anna on a one finger. I've got a couple I can jump in on, but I usually like to try to hang back and get others involved. Anna.
It was a two-finger. It was a two-finger regarding the variable military engagement. So we talked a lot about unpacking this violence against civilians, that perhaps you should distinguish between discriminate and indiscriminate violence, and I totally agree with this. But I think the variable of military engagement is very broad, the way you use it. And I think it would be nice if you can connect to Balcells and Kalivas APSR 2010, that they talk about technology of rebellion, and they talk about symmetric versus asymmetric fighting. And guerrilla is just one of the strategies of the rebels. So I'm not familiar with the Sierra Leone case and whether there is a variation there in terms of military strategy of the rebels and the government, but I think it's worth looking into rather than using this broad term of military engagement. Also in the paper, I noticed that in some places you talk about guerrilla warfare as direct engagement between the government and the fighters, whereas I think guerrilla warfare is actually an indirect form in which rebels use hit-and-run strategies rather than direct to clash with the rebels. So I think, and I wrote it in my comments too, I think you should clarify this and kind of separate different types. And finally, I think, so this idea of looking at sexual violence, it's interesting, but unfortunately your data has a lot of missing observations, and you cannot claim to have like even a small fraction of the universe of cases. So I think you should drop it and just look at violence against civilians and violence against the military and different types of violence against these two targets, and it would be an interesting paper in itself. You don't have to, combine it also with the sexual violence data. That's all for now.
Okay, thank you. Do I just respond? Is that
sure, if you'd like to, yeah.
Okay. So the military engagement category is very broad, and it might be better that I just kind of narrow that definition down to the more direct engagements, which is in fact how I operationalize it. So that might be better just to put it in like that. And then if I've referred to guerrilla warfare as direct violence, that was just a mistake that I need to go back and check. I completely understand your comments on the sexual violence. I'm very reluctant to do that because it is of particular interest to me. But I completely understand why you're making that argument. And I think the kind of missing data is something that needs to be addressed probably more thoroughly than I have. Basically, I don't want to drop it, but maybe it's something I need to look more at. It's something that it is an idea that I want to pursue, but it might be that the data in this project isn't quite there. So I will be looking more at that and how, if I can, kind of improve that at all, and if I can't, whether it is kind of more of a hindrance to the project, because I don't want to end up, as much as I do want to include it, I don't want to end up in a kind of quagmire of, well, you're using this data which isn't really telling us much, and I don't want that to end up being the focus of the project. So that is something that I think I need to probably look a lot further into.
And if I can jump in on a two-finger here, I want to echo a couple of the things that Anna said. I think the Balcells and Kalibas symmetric asymmetric distinction, you at minimum want to engage it, right? You either want to explain why you think your approach is better or fold it in, but I think you definitely want to connect to that. And I also want to echo abandoning the sexual violence, not in the project, but for this chapter of the dissertation / paper. I think you can do well by not including it, and I think it's not for me. It's not just a data thing. I didn't understand conceptually the distinction. I can think of lots of conceptual distinctions, but as I read the paper, it wasn't clear to me. I saw a definite distinction between what I would call counter-force targeting as opposed to civilian targeting, but it seemed to me that in your paper, sexual violence was just a particular type of civilian targeting. That may not be true, but if so, those distinctions need to be drawn. Second, I really didn't follow the argument of why it was that medium level versus weak government forces would use sexual violence as opposed to civilian targeting, and so my reaction was to really focus on that distinction between civilian and counterforce, and focus on the contested territory strength as measured by contested territory, and I would encourage you to change. I didn't find the logits and the multinomial logits very compelling, so I would encourage you to think instead about looking at the ratio, right? So one of the things we talked about was the overlap. But if we imagine either the ratio or the proportion of military engagements to civilian targeting, leaving sexual violence for another part of the project, then I think your hypotheses should play out there, and it avoids this problem of, we know that they really use mixes of these things, and one of the things about being at Penn State is that you've got a whole bunch of colleagues as well as faculty who are methods whizzes, and data regression is the model that you probably want to adopt if you're going to go with ratios. And you could even, and what I would like to see is a model of, you know, the RUF at some geographic unit level, and with a lag of what that group had done the last time, a measure of what the opponent is doing in that current time period, but then also to take in geographically, what about the neighboring regions, and then measure those again for the entire, you know, for the rest of the country that isn't neighboring. And I gathered that's I know your current data aren't structured that way, but it seems to me you have all the information you need to structure your data that way, and that strikes me as a very rich, interesting research design that ties much more strongly to the promise of that we find in the abstract and the introduction than what you currently have.
Okay, yeah, that all makes a lot of sense to me. So I need to go back and either be much clearer or think about removing the sexual violence from this section of the project. So okay.
Well, Anna has it too, so why don't I let you think about that and
Yeah.
turn it over to Anna while you do.
Okay, I have really short comments. First, about this using ratio between military engagement and civilian targeting idea. So I wasn't sure if you can actually compare events. If one event, if the military engagement event is comparable to targeting civilians event. Because in your data you have a lot of targeting of civilians. So I don't know if it's because targeting of civilians was so dominant in this conflict, or because they're just like shorter events that you count them as separate events. So I don't know to what extent it would be informative. But and the second point, I really think that Will's suggestion about restructuring data and using some sort of time series cross-sectional structure of the data would be much more informative. Also because violence depends on a lot of structural factors like topography, distance from borders, distance from the capital, and currently you don't control for those things. But if you have some sort of like province month or province quarter data set, you could easily use like fixed effects and control for those time invariant factors that affect the type of violence that you observe. That's all.
Thank you, Emma. Do you want to respond?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so I think the idea of using geographic units is really interesting, and what I had been thinking of doing and trying to build up the qualitative information to be able to do that was for the project as it continues would have been to then kind of build up a case study of a particular unit and go from the quantitative analysis and then kind of draw out some of those patterns within this qualitative example. That's obviously not quite what is being suggested here. So that's a different approach that I'll look into. And like I said, I have this data set that I'm starting to kind of develop of the village months. So that might be a way to do it as well. I also have I don't have the distance from the borders, although I was hoping to the next step of the the kind of final step of the data collection was the GIS analysis. And so the distance from the borders could very simply be done within that section. I do have all of the information on the topography, so that would be very easy to include. So the only one that I include at the moment is whether the event took place in an urban area or not. But I have all of the information on the rest of the topography, so that would be pretty simple to do.
Great, thank you. We've got Christian on a one finger, and then Paige, we're going to want to get you involved here.
So I should ignore my two? Or can I do my two first?
Sorry, I totally missed your two. So.
Oh, okay. So
yeah,
the two was to share in the folks' opinion regarding sexual violence taken out of this, but retained in the project. And in part, I think our kind of like logics of violence discussion is under conceptualized in many respects, right? So you left out collective violence, right? So we have indiscriminate, selective, and collective. But even that's not informative enough for me, because I'm just like, effectively think of the following dimensions. So perpetrators, victim, degree of violence, objective, and then action. And the reason why action is important is because I couldn't quite figure out why the sexualization of the violence actually mattered. And you didn't actually highlight that. It was just kind of like, and then there's sexual violence. But I think in order for that dimension to matter, then the nature of the sexualization, which you just kind of associated with humiliation, and I'm just kind of like, not every culture is going to be equally susceptible to humiliation, right? And so without getting us to what the norms are within the culture, what, honor societies or whatever, unless you took us there, then I didn't quite see the added benefit of the sexualization. The one finger, I have a series of them, but I'll just do one for now, or I'll do two. But one was, so you kind of have holding territory as a manifestation of strength, leading to tactical selection. But I was like, wouldn't a military engagement, isn't that like facilitating holding territory? I mean, like, because right now it's kind of like set up as the holding of territory leads to tactical selection, but I'm kind of like, I don't know if that's necessarily just an outcome, as it could be an input into holding territory. Now, obviously, this varies by the type of conflict, right? So if the conflict is about territorial conflicts, then the dynamics might be different than if it's an ideologically oriented conflict, because then territory maybe doesn't matter as much. And so, and this leads to the second point, which was kind of a conflation of all the civil wars. And so I'm like, so the civil wars probably vary by objective, but that's not in there. But they also vary by some of these other things that you kind of like sidestep, right? So, so genocides take place within civil wars, and I think those civil wars are very different from the ones where genocide doesn't take place. Revolutions quite frequently happen within the context of civil wars. Atrocities take place within civil wars. So it's kind of like all the civil wars are kind of like lumped together in a sense, and I'm wondering how, as you think about how this moves to other cases and so forth, but even thinking about this case, how your objectives could change over time, how the importance of territory changes over time, and context, how the objectives shift. And so that was the thing that I was kind of looking for, in a sense that I think might help better inform and get us to kind of think about what was going on and what you kind of have a hold on.
Great, thank you. Emma?
Yes, so, okay, well, I've presented this paper a few times, and I have the comments are completely different every single time I talk to people about it. So as much as I don't want to drop the social violence data, it's also quite nice that there seems to be a consensus building, so that is something. In terms of holding territory leading to tactic selection, or whether it's the other way around, or whether both of these things are affected by a kind of a third. Yes, basically, I'm struggling on how to operationalize strength in a way that I can do for the government and for the rebel groups. And I can do So within the cross-national study, I use troop numbers, but there are their own problems with that, and it doesn't tell us everything that we really need to know to know what the relative or even absolute strength of the groups are. So with this, I'm really trying to try out another way of how we can think about strength, and especially within a micro study. So within a case, because it does vary across the country, and that is true for the government as well as for the rebel groups.
Could you insert that into the piece? I mean, so that would be a very good use of the kind of qualitative information.
Yeah.
This territory means a great deal to the government. This territory means a great deal to the rebels, and thus the kind of holding it or losing it then ends up having a certain kind of degree of salience, which shows your idea or demonstrates your idea of strength a lot more.
Yeah, I can absolutely do that.
I think Paige had a finger up, but it's hidden by the camera.
Ah, great, Paige. Emma, did you want to continue, or are we ready to go to Paige?
No, we can go to Paige.
Okay, great, Paige.
Great. Sorry, I guess my camera setup is a little funny, and I can't hear you guys all that well. So I apologize if anything I say has been said already. The sound has gotten a little better, but especially
Emma, can you mute?
Underwater. And I'm contending with you pretty speak noise. So I have a couple comments though on this issue of whether you should take out of. I actually that's the part of this I like the most. Yep.
Emma, can you mute? Because we're getting a little bit of feedback through you.
Yes.
Fabulous. Sorry about that, Paige.
Okay, is that better? Okay. So I was saying that I don't know whether it should be part of this chapter specifically, but the thing that I like most about this project is the fact that you're looking at the three types of violence together and theorizing about how they will be used by groups in different situations. So I would push back a bit about taking out the sexual violence part. I agree with Christian that we could use some more theorizing about how the sexual nature of it is important, thinking about the very personal nature or what. So I think we could use a bit more of the theory, and I also agree with Anna's point that we need some discussion of that this is not a very small percentage of the actual sexual violence. You know, if it's a fairly random sample, then that's not a problem. It probably isn't, but maybe some thought into how that might bias the findings might be enough. So I think I would argue keep it in, but do more to justify it theoretically, and also to talk about how the missingness in the data might be affecting the results. So I think if you're just very upfront about that, that would be okay. I also wanted to second what Christian was saying, and others were nodding their heads when he said it, about a slightly circular nature to the argument, not in the sense of tautological, but in the sense of there's a reciprocal stuff going on here. So the argument, if I understand it, is that groups use violence in order to enable taking control of territory, but in the empirical part, you're looking at control of territory driving the use of violence. So that's a tricky thing to deal with empirically when you've got, control of territory or lack thereof drives violence, and then violence, if the strategy is actually working, violence should be then leading to control of territory. That might be something you want to incorporate into the empirical study of whether violence against civilians and or sexual violence at one stage that actually does allow groups to take control of that territory. That's what the theory is based on. So that's an empirical question about whether it works. And that's, I think, connected to a couple of other comments I have on the theory side. We do some in the paper, but I would like to see more of spelling out exactly how violence against civilians and separately sexual violence helps groups end up controlling territory. You kind of, in some ways, there's an argument that there are a bunch of sort of threads of arguments in there, but I think they can be pulled apart and made clearer and justified better. So part of the argument is that if a group is weak, it will try to weaken, by using violence against civilians, that sort of weakens everybody, and since it weakens the government and the rebels, somehow that's going to turn out to be in the rebels' favor. That only works if it actually is weakening the government relative. Sorry, it sounds like you can't hear me very well. Is it a volume thing or an enunciation thing?
I was struggling a little bit. I think it might be more kind of connection.
Okay, I'll try to talk a little slower and enunciate a little better. So what I was saying is the argument that weak groups sort of disrupt society in a way that will weaken both governments and rebels, but that will redound to the benefit of the rebels. I didn't quite follow that logic entirely. Then there are also arguments about sending signals to the population that the other side can't protect them, and that is somehow going to lead to allegiance of those people to the group that's actually perpetrating the violence. That seems like a slightly odd logic, and it might be right? It might be that groups do side with the group that kind of cows them into submission more, but that's a slightly separate argument about intimidation rather than getting allegiance and loyalty. So I feel like there's sort of several, then there's also a thread about signaling to the other side that it can't protect civilians, which is, again, slightly different. Like, is the signal to the civilians themselves and it's going to affect their behavior, or is the signal to the government if it's the rebels who are perpetrating violence? I think all of that needs to be kind of, those threads need to be combed apart in a way and all made clearer. Then another issue that I think both has to do with theory and about the extent to which you can generalize from what you're learning in the Sierra Leone case to other types of civil wars, or what the bounds of that generalizability might be. A lot of the way you're talking in the theory section, I think, starts from the presumption that the civilians do not inherently support the rebels' cause. And I think that's largely true in Sierra Leone, but might be much less true in a war for secession or a war for control of the center, whether there's more of an ideological or an ethnic underpinning to it. So I like your categorization of wars not just into secession and control of the center, but also the third category of control over resources, which this was a case of. But it may be that the way your theory works only works for that type of war. So that's just maybe something to think through a little bit. Should I switch to stuff on data, or do you want to stick on theory for a while? I'm happy to do either.
Why don't we pause and give Emma a chance to respond and then come back to you?
Okay, sounds good.
I'm assuming Emma wants to respond. Is that true? Am I right, Emma?
Yes. Yeah, I'm just trying to get all of this down because it's all going to be really useful.
Don't forget it. We are on YouTube, and you can horrify yourself by watching yourself later. So if you don't get all the notes down.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
I'll also send you my copy if that's helpful.
Oh, thank you. That would be. Okay. So the question that Christian and Paige were pushing on about what is it about sexualization that makes violence, that makes sexual violence different. And I think it's true that we can talk about different degrees of how cultures are going to react to that. But at the same time, I think there's a pretty universal thread that sexual violence is such a heinous crime, and it is an attack kind of both against the individual but also against the norms of society. And so I think while there are differences in the response, maybe the societal response to that, I think that how it's viewed seems to be pretty similar across a lot of different societies. And I think it's that reaction or that that kind of assumption, that common thread that goes through that makes sexual violence something slightly different to violence against civilians. And in terms of how this breaks down the kind of fabric of society, I think within the context of conflict, it's seen as an attack, obviously against the individual, but it's seen as an attack against the society and as an attack against the values of the society. And what we see in so much of the sexual violence literature on conflict violence is that it is used to break down the fabric of society. And what I was kind of trying to push a bit within my setup was within a lot of the articles, a lot of the research I've been doing or I've been reading, that seems to be the end point. So sexual violence is used to break down the fabric of society, and that's the end of the story, but there has to be a why after that. Like, why are they trying to break down the fabric of that society? Like, sometimes it's genocidal and it's because they want to destroy that society just because they want to destroy that society. But genocide is relatively rare. So then there has to be an alternative logic to this as well. And what I'm trying to argue within my piece is that it could be more strategic. They break down the fabric of society in order to weaken that particular part of the enemy. So in this case, it would be the civilians who are not supporting the rebels. And if they're not, so the idea would be that the rebels are not strong enough to gain kind of more legitimate support, which would be preferable because that would cost them less to get. So they try and destroy the society instead because it makes it then easier to take over. And so that was kind of why that led me down the path of kind of why sexualization of violence was slightly different and why it should maybe be included in something like this.
Emma, both Christian and Anna have popped up two fingers. Can we break? Oh, we've got three of them. So Paige, we still got you. We're coming back to you. But can we do two fingers and then come back to you, Emma? Yep. So we'll go Christian, Anna, and then Jessica.
Okay, I'm generally a fan of this fabric of society thing, but I think it's like really vague, which is okay, but we have different takes on it, right? So Eckstein would talk about the coherence and congruence of society. We know that the fabric of society varies, and that's the point. I mean, we have world value surveys, we have value studies, we have network models. Eckstein and Gurr would take you to kind of how the values and how the society is ordered varies by families and communities and regions. I mean, so we have all this variation, so I don't think there's one fabric of society. On the universal discuss thing, I'm just like, I mean, I hate to say it or I hate to remind people, but some societies don't view women as human beings. So clearly, they're not going to care if they're targeted, right? So if you had some measure for rights of women or like their ability to do certain things in the society to get at that variation. So I'm like, I don't know how much this varies within country, but I think this is like, I think it's fascinating in the sense that I don't think we know that much. So to argue that there's like a universal disgust towards certain types of things, I'm just like, if you want to say mutilation of 3-year-olds, I might agree with you. But attacking women, I hate to say it, I don't think that universally that's going to pop up.
Okay, thanks.
I respond to.
Now let's go to Ann. Let's collect all three of these, and then come back to you, Emma. Okay.
A very brief comment that an alternative explanation for sexual violence is Jeremy Weinstein's theory that it's not a strategic decision by the rebels or the military to target whoever is not loyal to them, but it's a matter of discipline of the fighting unit, their composition, their motivations, and so on. So I wouldn't infer some strategic design here from these attacks. That's it.
Right, and I would add Neil Mitchell's book, Agents of Atrocity, what he calls Count Tilley's Reward, and the whole, right, we all know where the term booty comes from, right? Sorry, Jessica.
Sir Mix-a-Lot?
So, I was wondering if sex causes more of a breakdown, like the social fabric breakdown thing that makes sense, but does it cause more of a breakdown than other ways that, like, making, child soldiers kill their families, right, or something like that? Or, like Christian said, like mutilating a 3-year-old, but like killing a 3-year-old, is that because it's almost implicit, like you're saying sexual violence is worse than just killing people, right? By saying, and I don't know. But then also, is the breakdown, so you talk about it as weakening the social fabric, weakening, if the rebels are doing it, weakening the government, but is it also, could you argue that it's being used to also build up the rebels? And so that would be a different thread, is that it's being used to strengthen their cohesiveness, strengthen their ranks so that these people can no longer, the child soldiers or whatever, can no longer enter society. Now they have to fight. And so that's, rather than just looking how it's weakening, how it's strengthening one side.
Okay, great. Emma.
Okay, so lots of really interesting comments there. The idea that fabric of society varies is really interesting, and is obviously not something that I've really gone into. So that is something I definitely will be looking into. On the comments of how women are viewed in different societies, I think that is true. Except what I would say is, even in societies where women don't seem to be valued intrinsically, sexual violence against women is still seen as a pretty heinous crime. And it might not be because the women themselves are important, but they're important in terms of the family structure and their position within society, within the family, and what that represents within society. So I'm not sure I would agree 100% on that, but I mean, in terms of women's own values, that is completely true. In terms of whether it is just non-strategic, whether it's just the kind of spoils of war and this is what's going to happen, that is certainly part of the story as to why sexual violence happens in conflict. I would at no point argue that that's not true. I think there are enough examples to show that that's not the whole story, though, that there are occasions where it's used as a strategy, and where that directive kind of comes down from people at a higher level than just whoever happens to be in command of that unit in the field at that point in time. And so I think there is something else going on here as well, and that's what I'm trying to explore with this. So it's kind of it's part of the story. It's not a holistic argument in terms of why sexual violence happens in conflict. It's looking at a particular part. In terms of whether it causes more of a breakdown in the fabric of society than other forms of violence, and particularly the example of child soldiers killing their parents is a great one. And to be honest, it's not something that I really have thought much about. I think that's a great example. And it's something that I'm definitely going to have to look into more closely. In terms of strengthening cohesiveness, some of the, one study in particular by Dana Cohen at Harvard's just came out like last year, 2 years ago, and that's exactly her argument, that sexual violence is used in conflicts where the rebel group is kidnapping and abducting recruits. So when they can't attract recruits and they're kidnapping them, making them engage in forms of sexual violence is a way to bind them to the group, because they fear that they will be rejected by their society when they go home, if they try to go home. So that is kind of another side of the argument. What I find quite interesting about that, and why I think it's maybe not also the whole story, is that the results for that, well, she found that was the case particularly for gang rapes. So when it was a group of men, and then it's kind of, well, you all took part in this, so now none of you can escape. And so again, I think that's one part of the story, but I think there's also other parts of the story that can be explored a bit more.
Okay, great. Let's take it back to Paige, and you were either going to go more data or theory, and I think we should leave it up to you to pick.
Okay, great. Just one thing to kind of summarize or cap up some of what has just been said about, I think there are several alternative arguments here that might relate relative strength to violence, and particularly sexual violence, that have been mentioned. So the Weinstein argument that sort of this just happens kind of almost naturally if groups aren't strong enough to prevent it, and then the Derek Cohen argument about it happens as a way for groups in order to strengthen their cohesiveness. I think the key for you is going to be to figure out empirically how you can separate those arguments from your argument. I think it's great that you're making this alternative argument to that, but I don't see quite yet how you can tease out, and it may not be something you can do with these data, it may be something that has to come through interviews or qualitative work or something else, but I think a focus on trying to think about, what would we expect to see if it was each of these three things, two alternatives, and it would be how I would kind of urge you to go with that. And I think I'm still left a little bit with the question of, I can see how sexual violence breaks down the fabric of society, but the link from breaking down the fabric of society to enabling rebel control, and particularly when you're then making the flip side of the argument that governments also use it, how is it that governments could be using it strategically to take control. So I think that kind of spelling out that link a little bit more explicitly would be helpful. A couple of comments on the data and analysis side. One issue on the data is that the overall number of events, not just the sexual violence events, which it's clear why those are low relative to what actually happened, but the violence against civilians and the military engagement numbers also seem quite low to me. This was a conflict that went on for 9 years. It was a pretty brutal conflict. Maybe the fact that the military engagement numbers are kind of low in this particular war isn't so surprising. But it just made me wonder, what's missing, and is what's missing systematic or not? And so you don't necessarily need to speak to that now unless you have ideas about it, but I'd be curious kind of why those numbers are so low. Are they, sorry, there's a fire truck going by. I'm just going to wait 1 sec.
And Emma, you may want to, if you would.
Sorry. Okay, it's passed.
Christian is now missing New York.
Yeah. There was a gas explosion in the restaurant downstairs in my building last night. So you should have heard the sirens last night. And then this has been mentioned, I think, already, but trying to think about whether territorial control is a good measure of strength. Maybe it is, and maybe it's the best one that is available for this, but there are arguments specifically about territorial control and violence against civilians, and Kalibas's arguments and others. So I think if you're going to use territorial control as your measure, you need to engage with those arguments more directly. On the analysis, I've got a few more little comments on the data, but I'll send you my comments. On the analysis side, one thing I think that would be easy to do, it sounds like you've done it already, is to show the graphs of the RUF and government violence separately, because lumping them together really doesn't get at your argument at all. Your argument is about the relative strength of these two groups. So when one side is strong, then the other side is by definition weak. And so it's not clear to me what we should see when they're lumped together. Your argument is really about them separated. So I would take out the graphs of them lumped in together and put in the graphs of them separately. And then I was a little confused. I'm just pulling up the results in the tables. I was a little confused by them for two reasons. One, if I read you correctly, the options for territorial control are that there's government control, there's rebel control, or there's contested control. But all three of those are in the regression. So this is the coefficient for government control as compared to what? Right? There has to be another, because these are dummy variables, right? So there has to be some omitted dummy, and I don't know what that is. Then a second and related question is, I like the fact that you're looking not just at control at the time of the incident, but also control 1 month prior. But I don't think you should just stick those in as two separate independent variables. I think you need to construct a variable that combines them, or think about how they interact, right? Because what you're getting now is the effective government control holding government control a month ago constant. But what you really want is some sense of whether some separation of established control versus new control. So I would argue that you should take these variables and combine them into something that is closer to the theory you're trying to test, and then include that variable in the regression rather than just kind of throwing them in. I don't know how to interpret these coefficients the way they are now for those two reasons. So those are my main comments.
Great, thank you, Paige. Emma?
Yes, okay, that's great. Yeah, how to distinguish between the strategies is something I don't know how to do right now. But that that would be a really interesting thing to do. So that is definitely something that I will think about. It is a very low number of observations, and I was a bit disappointed in that. When I transformed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission data, part of the reason that it is as low as it is because I was looking for very specific information. So there's a lot of data within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission data that I haven't included because the only date I have for it is it happened in 1995. And I wanted to narrow it down at least to a month so that I could so that I had the territorial information and some of the other information that I was using. And so that accounts for why the numbers are lower maybe than would be expected. I think even if I can find a way to include some more of that data, the numbers are still going to be relatively low. And that is in part because I think of how I've combined the data. So where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission says, you know, we have a data set of 40,000 observations, that's one observation per individual. Whereas what I've tried to do is combine them into events. And so if there was an event in, if 200 people in one village was attacked on one day, then that is one event within my data set. So part of it is combinations, part of it is that it's at a higher level than I was trying to disaggregate to, and I think part of it is just it's missing violence data. So those are kind of issues that I've been grappling with, and there might be ways to get around some of those. So a couple, just to kind of clarify on your last couple of comments, because I think that I did do what you are saying, but clearly I haven't made that clear enough. So within tables 1 and 2, I think. Hold on, sorry, let me just pull them up. Yeah, within tables 1 and 2, so these are summaries. So of just the explanatory variables. So where that's government control in the first box with military engagements, that is in contrast to rebel control and contested control. So that is government control against everything else. So rebel control and contested control are not included in the model. They are the reference category, if that makes sense. These are just summaries. So if you go down to the appendix, you'll see the full models. And then you can see how I've...
Okay, so the column in Table 1 is not a single regression. They're actually coefficients from different regressions.
Yeah.
Okay. I had the same confusion page, did I? I follow it now.
Yeah, so I did put that in a note, but I think it is...
It needs to be in the text.
Okay.
Because it's unorthodox, right? And readers are lazy. I'm not, but other readers are lazy.
So yeah, so in the appendix you'll see the full models, and then you can see what the reference categories are. In terms of control 1 month, and so trying to get at the idea that they have controlled that territory for a while, that is only coded as a 1 if they are in control of the territory at the point in time when the event takes place, and they also control the territory in the month leading up to that attack. So if they controlled it a month prior but didn't control it at the time of attack, that would not be coded as a 1. So again, I think the labels on that could probably be better. But that's, I think that I did do what you're suggesting with that, if I've understood correctly.
I'd like to piggyback on something that I think you mentioned earlier, Emma, and encourage you. And this is, I think it might be able to make its way into the paper, but I think it would at least be a useful exercise for helping you flesh out the theoretical arguments, as many of us have been encouraging you to do, and that is to actually identify some some accounts of actual events where a group, where one of the groups is not weak. To cover all of your categories, right? Where one of the groups where it's contested territory, and then where groups used more sexual violence than than targeted, or whatever the hypotheses are, right? I'm not saying this very clearly. Try to go through and identify at least one actual case that illustrates what you think is happening. Because I'll go back to, as Paige was putting it, as I was arguing before, I think there's, I don't think you haven't leveraged the existing literature well enough, and, as Paige was putting it, there's, it's splitting apart the threads and then reconstructing, because you do, I think I agree with the others that you do have an argument here, but it's not fully fleshed out yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should be able to tell actual stories from real events that illustrate. And since you do have a very rich, historical descriptive accounts at your disposal, I'd encourage you to go that route and see. Again, it may not make its way into the paper, but I think it might be a useful exercise. And we've got two. Let's go Jessica and then Christian, and we're rapidly running out of time, so try to make it quick.
I just wanted to agree with Will that it would be very helpful to have actual anecdotes in there, and it also maybe in your introduction, if you have a story about a government, or either the government or the rebels' central command sending down an order that they are to use sexual violence or they are to use violence against civilians, that would kind of allow you to combat this idea that people are going to say, hey, it's just gratuitous or it's just unit level. Making a decision and say, well, here's an example of where it's not, and so this is why it's worth exploring more.
Quickly, I think there needs to be some discussion of bias. I mean, so UCDP, I don't think people really understand where their information comes from. It would be useful to talk about it. If a lot of it comes from the media, which is my common perception, I don't know that this is true, but then there should be some discussion of media bias in there, because you have urban area that pops up significantly quite frequently, and we wouldn't be surprised if urban areas are more likely to be in newspapers and thus in UCDP. And then, what's the Commission for the Truth and Reconciliation effort? What's their mandate? What are they supposed to go out and find? How were those locations selected? Out of how many? It would be useful to kind of mention that. Why not use UCDP? I mean, as we think about contextualization and how the case fits, it's kind of Sierra Leone is a case in the UCDP database. Where does it fit relative to other civil wars across time? I mean, it would be useful to just see where Sierra Leone is over time relative to these other conflicts and how the characteristics are similar or different. And last, polity index. I don't know that anyone could use that anymore after Vreeland destroyed it. So the minute I saw that, I was kind of get that out of there. But that was it. Yeah,
I think, right, Emma, some of that stuff that Christian's suggesting probably, perhaps belongs in other chapters. But as you're thinking about a single, as a single paper that would not be part of the dissertation, but would come out as its own standalone submission, I encourage you to. Your appendix right now is all just tables, and I think that a lot of the sorts of things he was talking about would work well, and there are a few others that go ahead and talk about that thing in an appendix, right? Because you have space to offer that kind of background. So, all right, Emma, do you want? They got 2 minutes. You want to ask the group anything or respond?
No, I don't think I have any questions right now. And in terms of well, the kind of anecdotes and the stories is definitely something that I want to start including. So that should be appearing hopefully quite soon. And the discussion of the biases within the data that will be included within a specific kind of methods section later on. Within the dissertation, obviously. I think I just want to say thank you. This has been great. I was a bit nervous, but you've all been really nice. And this has been incredibly helpful. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Well, thank you, Emma, for submitting such an interesting piece, and thanks to everybody else for doing the hard work and making this effort of Christian and I's happen, because you guys get nothing but thanks for it. So we appreciate you jumping in and helping out with it. All right, great. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Peace.
Bye.